So the numbers are still going up, and I'll kick off so that we stick to time. My name's Nick Hillman. I'm director of HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, and welcome to this webinar on international students, the graduate route visa, and all related things. You can see the guests that we've got on your screen. I'm going to open proceedings, and then we're going to hear from Linda Cowan, Managing Director of Kaplan Pathways, with whom we are hosting this event and with whom we've done a huge amount of work over the years in relation to international students. Then we'll hear from Alex Hall-Chen, who works with the Institute of Directors, who helped us with our most recent report on the graduate route visa. And Alex will be able to provide the perspective of her members, including SMEs. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Stephen Isherwood, who you should be able to see on your screen as well, who's the CEO of the Institute of Student Employers. So the format for the event is I'm going to do some introductory scene setting. Then we'll hear from those three speakers, and then we'll move to a Q&A. And we do want this to be a participatory event, even though it's only going to last an hour. And so please do put your questions into the Q&A box, the chat box, down the bottom of the screen, ideally the Q&A box, and we'll keep the chat box for technical problems. And we'll try to put your questions. And in fact, we might ask you to put your questions direct. We'll turn on your microphone and get you to put your questions direct to our three speakers. So thank you all for attending. I've now got a few slides I want to show to contextualize our conversation this morning. And hopefully you can probably see all sorts of things on my screen. What I wanted to do was just run very briefly through some of our work at HEPI. As you know, we're the UK's only independent think tank for higher education on international students, almost all of which has been produced with Linda and her colleagues at Kaplan Pathways. And ending with the report that we published the first week of this year, 2023. So the first piece of work we did actually many years ago, 8 years ago, was when we polled people on their way to university. There were concerns then, as there are now, that British students didn't particularly want to learn alongside people from other countries, and maybe there'd be worries that it would slow down the class, or it was, you know, a time you'll remember when people were talking about British jobs for British workers and things like that. And actually we found the complete opposite. We went out and asked people who had applied to university but weren't yet there, would you like to study alongside people from other countries when you get to university? And only 2% disagreed. Because they recognise the question. There were other questions in the survey as well, but this one on your screen was particularly about whether you would recognise learning alongside people from other countries was valuable to your own future employment. And you can see very high levels of support. So that was really, we dipped our toe in the water. It was a small piece of work, 2,000 applicants were surveyed. And then after the Brexit vote in 2016, we realized that nobody had done any really detailed modeling on what the vote for Brexit, which of course was unexpected, at least within our sector, was likely to mean for the flow of international students. So we worked with Kaplan and HEPI, worked with London Economics to model that. And we found that there was likely to be a 57% drop-off in incoming EU students each year. Financially, the drop-off would be less big because the ones that kept coming would pay the larger full international fees. And for many years, that data just sat there because, of course, Brexit didn't actually happen for a few years while all the negotiations were going on. But once that effect did hit, we found our numbers, amazingly, given the sensitivities here, were pretty much bang on. UCAS, the first UCAS numbers for post-Brexit applicants were down 56%, and we'd predicted 57%. So, and I think that still remains the most detailed piece of work on the impact of Brexit on student flows, which of course is now we're seeing actually happen. And then we were worried about the way the parliamentary debates were going during the period when, for example, Theresa May was Home Secretary and then Prime Minister. And there were other organisations that had calculated the value of international students to the UK, and the numbers were very significant. But whenever we went to the Home Office and said, look, why do you have the attitude you sometimes have towards international students when it's so clear that they are economically beneficial to the country? I mean, I literally had this conversation, for example, with Damien Green when he was Migration Minister. They said, yeah, but all the numbers produced by the lobbyists in the university sector are just the positive numbers. They don't take into account any of the extra costs that the UK faces when it accepts so many international students. And so we thought, fine, let's go and calculate the net numbers, not just the gross numbers. And we've done that twice, and the two reports are on the screen there. And the gross numbers the last time we did it were nearly 30 billion, 28.8 billion, as you can see from the Pi News coverage there. But the net benefits were still about 25 billion, because the costs of hosting so many international students are actually slim. For example, they pay the NHS levy, they cover off many of the extra costs that do come. So the numbers are still north of 25 billion. And then the second thing we did, which no one else had done, as far as I'm aware, was we broke them down to a parliamentary constituency level. So we could write, and we've done this multiple times, to literally every member of parliament in the House of Commons with the numbers for their own constituency. And every constituency in the country, whether it actually hosts a university or not, benefits from the presence of international students. You know, they may have student teachers in their local schools, student nurses in their local hospital, even if they don't have the presence of a university, or students living there, even if they're not studying in that actual constituency. And the numbers are positive and very large, particularly in some places like London and Sheffield and Nottingham. And we're hoping to update those numbers for post-COVID scenario in due course. And then we looked at what they did in other countries, and a study we did, for example, in Germany, which found that when the Germans discuss international students and the benefits they provide to Germany, they don't just look at those people while they're students. They also look at what happens to the which in the UK is a minority of international students who stay in the country after finishing their studies. So we did another bit of work, Kaplan and HEPI, with London Economics, where we looked at what happens to, as I say, the minority of students who stay in the country to work. And we found not only do they pay very, very significant amounts of tax and national insurance to the Treasury, but also they tend to fill in skill shortages at employers that Brits alone couldn't do. And we could prove that because international graduates who went into the private sector tended to end up on higher salaries than others, showing they really are filling in desperately skill shortages, or they went into the public sector where there are, as we know, also desperate skills shortages. And then 2021, we did a piece of work saying, well, look, we're accepting all this money from international students. They are making our campuses more diverse. They are making our universities better financially, but in pedagogy and all sorts of other ways as well. But are we fully delivering for them? And I was concerned from some of the messages I heard from international students about some of the support services. So some international students feel, some of this data shows that they're paying more than home students and sometimes getting an inferior service. For example, into relation to careers advice when it comes to that transition into the labour market. And so we wanted to flag that and work with AGCAS and student employers and others on what more could be done to support international students, support getting them work experience, getting them to the labour market, maybe university. We had an interesting debate over whether university career services should understand labour markets abroad as well as labour markets in the UK, and there were split opinions on that. And that brings us to the piece of work that we published first week of this year, January 2023, which was around the graduate route visa, which, as most people listening in on this call will know, is actually a fantastic route for international students to stay in the UK for up to 2 years in most instances, with very little paperwork. There are some costs for the international students, no cost for the employers. And it's a very good way for international graduates to stay in the UK for a couple of years, maybe convert to a different visa and stay longer, maybe go home after the couple of years are over. And also for employers to fill in their skills shortages. But we polled through Alex, who you'll hear from in a minute, and her members, employers, and just give you 3 slides on the data, and then I'll stop. We found about 20% of the employers in our survey, and Stephen's got data from other employers as well, had at some point sponsored a visa for an employee already, or are in the process of doing so. That's the 19% and the 1%. And another 35% had not yet done so, but would consider sponsoring a visa for an employer. And of course, as I say, for the graduate route visa, there's no actual employer sponsorship needed. It's light touch. And then we asked why you hadn't, if you haven't currently sponsored a visa for an employee, why you hadn't done so. And I won't go through all the numbers here, but bureaucracy was a big factor. Apart from many employers felt they didn't need to do that, they could find the skills they needed from their local labour market, but others, 21% too much bureaucracy, 13% too expensive, 10% takes too long. So bureaucracy was a theme that came through our survey loud and clear. And then the number that I think won the headlines was specifically when we asked about the graduate route visa. Only 3% of employers in our survey through the IOD said they had already made use of this new route. And 27% on the right there, so they didn't even know anything about it. And we gave people the opportunity to comment on their answers, and that came through loud and clear. People were not as aware of this route that we think is a fantastic way of using the skills of international graduates and hopefully to their benefit as well. And we titled our report on the final quote here, not heard of this. So I'm going to stop there, other than a little plug for our blog, which if you're not signed up to, please do sign up to it. We had a fascinating blog the other day from an Afghani student studying at the University of Sussex, asking what more the sector can do when it thinks about internationalization to help the education of women who, of course, been barred from education in Afghanistan. And I just draw your attention to that before I now stop sharing my screen. Those are the only slides you're going to get this morning, and hand over to Linda Cowan, who's Managing Director of Kaplan Pathways, to make her introductory remarks. Linda, over to you.
Nick, thanks thank you very much for that. Nick, again, it's a great history you gave of obviously all the joint work that we've been doing together. And actually, the recent piece of work was of real interest to us, that both as a company that obviously plays a significant role in bringing students both to the UK, but also to other countries where we work in partnerships with universities, both in North America and also in New Zealand and in Australia. But also to us as an employer, because actually we have been making use of the graduate route to fill vacancies within Kaplan, and we found it an enormously helpful way to actually fill vacancies, and at times where we've struggled to fill vacancies, but as a way to actually sort of see skill sets of candidates before we make sort of decisions on employing people through some other sort of visa routes. So I'm a huge fan and advocate of the graduate route. But certainly we've always felt that for the UK to stay competitive in what is a hugely competitive environment to attract international students, that there are many things that are important, but 3 of the things that we always highlight as being important is firstly that the regulatory environment does enable students, if they want to stay back and gain at least some work experience here for their future careers. Secondly, that students actually can get jobs and know how to get jobs. And then thirdly, that actually we're able as a sector to provide the data on where international students are getting jobs. So we're really keen to be keeping the spotlight on those three areas, because I think they're vitally important to enable the UK to sort of stay competitive for international students in the future. So if I run through probably just our quick observations on each of those sort of 3 points, I think one, just on the regulatory environment, and while I think we'd say, look, it's not perfect, I would certainly say having the graduate route has been enormously beneficial, and we can all see that from the stats in enabling the UK to stay competitive. I know Alex and Stephen, one of them will probably make a point around, for some sectors, actually the fact it's only 2 years compared to 3 years is a disadvantage, but certainly at least having 2 years. But I think for certain sectors, and particularly the STEM sector, actually us continuing to work with the government to see whether there's a possibility for a 3-year graduate route, I think would be enormously sort of helpful. But I think the graduate route really does help, and hopefully it will continue to stay. And I think we need to be vocal about the importance of it to enable the UK to sort of stay competitive within the sort of the sector. So really then on the second area, I think in terms of getting jobs, knowing how to get sort of the jobs, there is actually now a huge amount of information for international students around the graduate route, and actually for companies around the graduate route. So when we went into the research, I was partly thinking about, this is about gap of information potentially for employers on the graduate route. That's maybe, if there's not visibility, the reason behind it. But actually I've come out of this exercise thinking I'm less convinced that is the reason, because actually there's lots of really good information that has been produced. UKIS has produced some really good information. You look across various mission bodies, various sectors, bodies within the careers and employability sort of areas. And there's lots of really good, concise, clear guides that do highlight the ease of the graduate route. So I don't think it's so much about the tools that are there. It is about us in this next stage around how do we ensure we land that well with employers, we engage with employers to really raise awareness of the fact the graduate route is a much easier route to be employing international students, and to be filling areas where there is skill shortages and people are actually finding it more difficult to employ to fill sort of vacancies. So I think that the things I always probably vocal around in those areas is actually just one, as a sector, everything that we're all doing with companies, and whether that's the small, medium size, small companies, medium, larger companies, to constantly raise awareness around the sort of the graduate route. But I also probably reflect on ourselves as Kaplan and as a company about things we're not currently doing that we could do. An example for that is we don't currently put in any of our job adverts that actually we welcome applications from through the graduate route. So I think we can be a lot more vocal and visible to actually raise awareness around the graduate route, and I would say that's the same for universities, the same for companies. So I think us being more visible around this could definitely be a great step forward. And then my other reflection point, and I know in this webinar there's probably lots of people within the career services in universities, but actually I think we've got a huge role as education providers around how we help our international students to be more vocal with employers when they're applying for jobs. On the ease of the graduate route, because actually international students could play a huge role when they're speaking to employers to help employers just be aware of the fact that this is a much easier route for employing international students. So that's probably an area that I'd love us to be focusing on in the sector, is involving international students as being part of the solution to what we are doing next. And then that third area, and then I'll stop at this point and hand over to Alex. But the third area is where I always say is the massive missing piece of the jigsaw. We've got, as a sector, put ourselves in that position that we can give good quality data on employability for international students if we really, really do want to lead the way internationally and compete with other countries. So I personally don't think there should be, a board of governors or a university council around the country that shouldn't be having that is a key discussion point around, can we report on where our international students are getting jobs? Do we have that data? Because I think that's the massive missing part of the jigsaw that really is a sector I think we've got to sort of address over the next sort of period. But my summary, Nick, is really, I actually came out of the work that we did together optimistic, because although there was a relatively low awareness among some employers on the graduate route, I just see that as a huge opportunity, because there is so much more that we can be doing, either as individual employers or as a sector, that will continue to help create opportunities for international students and to keep us competitive for the future. Alex, I'll now hand over to you, but look forward to taking any questions later.
Great, thank you very much, Linda. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Alex Hall-Chan. I'm the Principal Policy Advisor for Employment and Skills at the Institute of Directors. Just for a bit of context, in case anyone's not familiar with us, we're an independent, non-party political membership organisation, and we represent around 20,000 company directors, senior business leaders and entrepreneurs. And we have particularly strong representation in the middle market of UK employers in terms of size. So we're really pleased to partner with HEPI on this research, in part because we're really interested in understanding the ways that employers can tackle the skills and labour shortages that are particularly acute at the moment, as I'm sure everyone's aware. Every month we send a survey to our members to better understand their perspectives on a range of policy issues, along with a few tracking questions that give us some economic insights. And one of those tracking questions asks members what the top negative factors affecting their organisation are. And since the lifting of pandemic restrictions, skills and labour shortages has consistently been a top 4 issue, only really behind inflation, the global economic outlook and UK political instability. We also asked our members at the end of 2022 what they would like government to focus on in 2023, and the 4th most popular answer was skill shortages. It is worth noting that our data shows that skill shortages have been reported by a sizable proportion of our members as an issue for years now, but it has become particularly acute in the past year and a half. So we're really interested in solutions to the skill shortages that our members are telling us are holding back their organisation's growth. A big part of that solution is clearly in training and upskilling programmes for people in the UK, but we see the immigration system as having a really important part to play in filling those gaps too. So we were really supportive of the introduction of the graduate route visa in 2021. Generally speaking, the main complaints that we hear from employers, as you heard from Nick earlier, about the immigration system centre around bureaucracy and cost. So the fact that potential employees and ones who are very highly skilled and eager to work in the UK come to employers already equipped with the right to work through the graduate visa route is clearly a huge benefit in terms of helping employers to access highly skilled employees easily. So given the extent of skill shortages in the UK and the advantages of the graduate route visa, it was a bit surprising for us that this research found that only 3% of our members have already knowingly used the graduate route visa system, although part of that is possibly down to the fact that the visa is still relatively new. What was more promising was that, as you heard earlier, 42% said that although they haven't yet used the visa, they would consider doing so in future. At the same time, 20% said they wouldn't consider using the graduate route visa to hire a former international student. Some of that response is probably down to members believing that they can meet their skills needs without recruiting people who need a visa to work in the UK, as well as potentially the feeling that a 2-year visa is simply too short term. I think the most interesting finding is that over a quarter of our members hadn't heard of the graduate route visa. In a way, it's not surprising. There is a perception among business leaders, and we hear this quite a lot, that governments change policies around immigration and skills so frequently that it's simply not worth the sort of human resource capacity needed to keep on top of that, especially if their skill shortages in their particular sector aren't that acute. But this lack of knowledge is a real shame when we know that many businesses are struggling to recruit the right skills, and there are international students who are highly skilled, highly qualified, who want to stay in the UK to work and have a visa to allow them to do that. So that leaves us with the question of what can we do about this? I think for a start, we would absolutely recognise that membership organisations like ourselves have a role to play in raising awareness among employers. We're actually in the process of researching interesting and innovative ways that employers are responding to skill shortages with a view to publishing a guidance document for our members. And we're looking at the immigration system and this particular visa as part of that. But there's also a role for government here. I think firstly, there's been a trend in recent years of the government considering targeting international students when they want to reduce net migration statistics. So the most crucial point here is that government doesn't take sort of a current lack of employer awareness as indicative of a lack of interest or support, and as a result withdraw the visa. There's also a wider need to make the whole immigration system less bureaucratic and expensive for employers to navigate. But in the first instance, we would encourage government to give this visa time to embed and to work with employers and employer representative organisations like ourselves to raise awareness about the benefits of the visa scheme. So thank you very much. I'll pass over to Stephen now.
Thanks, Alex. My name's Steve Ashaw, Chief Exec of the ISE. Just a little bit, if you haven't heard of the ISE, about who we are. If you're an older hand, you might know us as the AGR, the Association of Graduate Recruiters, what it used to be called. So we're a trade association, a members body. We've got a large constituency group. Lots of universities are members, got nearly 100 universities that are members, suppliers to the industry, but our main body of members, the reason we sort of exist, is our employer members, who typically tend to be larger type employers. Who run graduate programs, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. I think that's important when we look at some of the differences in the data between what we found our members said and what the respondents said from the IOD to the questions. We also supported very much the graduate visa route. We helped with the campaigning, etc., to get the graduate visa route reinstalled. It is about routes to employment. It is about skills shortages, but also we come at it from a cultural point of view. It is about having diverse campuses. It is about having an international outlook for both higher education and the students that go onto those campuses, international students coming into the UK, but also domestic UK students. We think it's very important they get that exposure. From where we come from a commercial point of view, that reflects the commercial reality that most of our members, or a lot of them, operate in, which is, mobile workforces, international businesses, etc., etc. So for a number of reasons, we think it's a really, really important thing. When we ask our members, we've asked this a few times over the years, actually, how many of them recruit international students, and how many, what percentage of their graduate intakes are made up by international students, those that need a visa. As I said, we've asked it a few times, and we typically get the same response. It's somewhere around the 10 to 15% of intakes, and that's a pretty consistent figure. It varies a little bit sector by sector, but that shows that actually employers do hire international students. One thing we haven't mentioned so far is actually the legal situation regarding hiring international students. And again, I think this comes in different employers with different levels of resources, whether they've got HR teams or not, might influence actually employers' understanding of the legal issue. Employers can't discriminate on international students, so they can't unless actually a specific role where visas are unavailable, for example, defence industries, other sectors like that. An employer actually cannot say, no, we won't hire you because you've got an international visa, or that you can't apply. So again, I think larger employers tend to know that, and that will influence whether they are open initially to applications from international students. So I mentioned the difference between those polled through the IOD and those polled through the ISE. Our members are typically graduate recruiters. They work in HR teams. Whereas the IOD respondents were mostly at C-suite, chief executive level. So I think that might have had a difference in understanding of the program in terms of responses. And also it might be the difference between larger and smaller firms. As I said, larger organizations with larger graduate teams that will have this on their radar automatically will have a greater understanding of the different visa routes and their implications. And I think that shows in the numbers. So as Nick said at the very start, 3% of IOD members had used the grad visa route, whereas actually 44% of ISE members, when we asked them, had used that route. But there are issues amongst visas, and we've already started to touch on some of these already. So I picked this up through the chat, but also when Nick said he was doing this work, I asked the same questions to our members that asked the IOD members. That point about the length of graduate programs, it is important. The average retention rate on a graduate program for our members is roughly 4.5 years. So actually employers are nervous about hiring people when there's only a 2-year time frame. What they don't want to do is get to sort of, that 2-year point and find that actually that visa can't be secured. So lots of our members, actually they go down the skilled route, even though they could use the graduate visa for that reason. If you think about professional qualifications, chartered accountancy, legal sector, etc., those are 3-year training programs, quite often qualification routes. So again, you've already got that kind of operational need in there. So yeah, lots of our employers will use the skilled visa route. Where they sometimes use the graduate visa is where there's a short-term problem, which comes onto this comment around bureaucracy that we've already heard a little bit about. One of the challenges for our members, who, not all of them, but most of them running structured programs, tend to start their hires in the autumn. And actually, they've often said that getting international students through that visa process in time to start can sometimes be a real challenge, because you miss your start date, you miss your induction. If you are doing a professional qualification, you miss the whole timetable start for that. So I knew some of our employers do use that graduate visa route, when actually they need to just get people into their organizations pretty quickly, and they might hire them on a temporary contract initially while that gets sorted out. To give you an idea of the implications of that cost and bureaucracy. Now, this relates mostly to the skilled visa route. One large employer, I won't say who they were, but quite a large recruiter of graduates every year, they said their budget line is £100,000 a year. I think we have to bear that in mind when talking to employers about international students, that there are significant costs attached. And even though the graduate visa is process light, it doesn't have any cash costs for the employer. There will be bureaucratic operational costs behind the scenes. Of course, employers are liable for making sure that actually everybody has an eligible right to work, and there are costs of that compliance that employers will bear that should be borne in mind. But I'm hoping this doesn't come across as sort of too negative. I'm trying to be pragmatic rather than bleak about the programme. I have noticed over the last year to 2 years a significant increase in the number of questions being asked by members on forums. So whenever we have forums where it is universities and employers interacting together, the most common question is, what are you doing about international students? What are you doing to hire those students? How do you make more opportunities available for those international students? So we definitely see the implications of that, of the ramping up of international student numbers, hitting that 600,000 target early, feeding through into the conversations that we have. We should always remember that the graduate market is always competitive, regardless of what's happening in the economic climate. Through the pandemic, applications per vacancy rose to record levels. It was about 91 on average, I think. So it is always competitive for students to get vacancies. So that again is something that we can bear in mind. Domestic, international students do often struggle to get onto those kind of graduate programs that we're talking about. There is an opportunity around explaining how the visas work to employers. I note that 15% of our members, even though I said that our members tend to be the ones that probably know most about visas, 15% of them were still very much unsure about the graduate visa route. So there's work to be done, and that figure was higher for IOD members. We've already referenced the employer guides that are out there. I don't know if we're able to put it in a link. I put it into one of the Q&A boxes, but I don't know if that comes through to you guys. But if you just type in recruiting international students, I've got it on my screen to the side of me, international student employability group that lots of us took part in. There's a really useful guide for employers there that demystifies the visa program and explains how it works. So there's lots that we can do there. And of course, there are skill shortages out there. There is a very real need to meet those skills gap for employers. It affects the UK economy, it affects individual employers. So there are those skill shortages. So it is worth unpicking those skill shortages sector by sector, because we do tend to generalize about the graduate route, about the graduate labour market, but it is a series of distinct different sectors with different needs and requirements. So advice for universities is to understand those different sectors and understand where the pressures are. Looking at our data last year, Very buoyant recruitment market. 9% of graduate vacancies still went unfilled at the year end. So that shows that there are opportunities in the system for meeting the needs of employers. There are vacancies that go unfilled every year. So that opportunity is there. And I think, and this is, I'll end on one of my other pieces of advice that I often give to universities when this subject comes up, which is, I think that opportunity for smaller to medium-sized employers who really don't understand the graduate visa route, don't know actually the fact that it is process light, those that do have immediate skills needs. I think it takes a bit more work and a bit more effort to find those employers, because it's a very fragmented end of the market, but there is definitely an opportunity there. So that's everything I wanted to cover to Nick. Hopefully we'll get some good, interesting questions where we can explore this in a bit more detail. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and thanks to Linda and Alex. I'm going to go straight into the questions because we've got 25 minutes and we've already had 16 questions submitted. Do upvote questions because I'll take them in order of popularity. And I'm not going to do one question, go back to the panel, one question, go back to the panel, because we'll only get through a few questions. I'm going to take a number of questions together. And we're going to see if the tech can hold up to get you to ask your own questions. Otherwise, I'll read them out. Joe Speed, can we turn on Joe Speed's microphone? And if they're happy to ask their question, fantastic. Otherwise, I'll read it out. Joe, good morning. Someone needs to unmute.
Sorry, I'm muted. Hi there. It was about the graduate working visa, the 2 years over 3. We're finding some large employers with programs longer than that are saying that international students can't apply. And it's just people's thoughts on that, because that's where there are some big companies who our international students have the skills for, who are turning them away. And it's just more to discuss that and what can we do to improve things in this area.
Thank you, Joe. What's your institution, Joe?
The University of Stirling.
Great, thank you, Joe. We might look in particular to Stephen to address that question in a moment. Let's go to Tripti. Hope I've pronounced your name correctly. Good morning. Hi, Tripti. I think you're on.
Hi guys. Can you hear me?
We can perfectly.
Awesome. So thank you so much for all the information. I just wanted to ask that we're constantly asked by students when they're reaching out to employers, how can they best communicate the fact that they are on a GIR and they don't need a visa? Because again, there's a lot of cultural aspect that comes into play when somebody's just 1 month into the country and they have to, apart from dealing with everything else, be communicative of this fact. What is the best way? Because more than you and me, a student will reach out to 500 employers to apply for jobs. They need to be at the front of, informing this to the employers, perhaps. So yeah, any thoughts on how we could train students, prepare some resources, or share those?
Thank you, Tripti. I realise I haven't quite been doing them in the upvoting order, so now I'm going to move to that. There's an anonymous question. When students are applying for a job and the first question is, do you have the right to work in the UK? Should they just be saying yes when they haven't secured their graduate route visa yet? My students worry a lot about being honest. Can we encourage more employers to change that question in a way that shows they welcome graduate route students? So I hope the panelists are making notes of these questions, and I'll do one more. Darcy Gilly, can we turn on their microphone? Morning, Darcy.
Hello.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, everyone. I was just wondering, in particular, I was kind of inspired by what Linda was saying, and then it was a thread that ran through. If individual HEIs could be doing more in terms of public affairs and PR locally and regionally to raise awareness of these issues. Don't often see it in local news headlines or in sources of news that employers might be reading.
Thank you, Darcy. What's your own institution? Are you working in a university?
I'm freelance, but I just started with Leeds Beckett for a period this morning. So
fantastic, great, thank you. I'm going to go back to the panelists now. I'm going to ask the panelists, if possible, to be brief so that we can do another round of questions before we stop at 11. So let's go in reverse order this time. Stephen.
I mentioned it when I was the piece I did. So it is worth highlighting to employers and students the case of Osborne versus Clark. So it is actually discriminatory for an employer unless they have a valid technical reason why they can't hire international students. As I said, people need a visa for defence industries is a good example of that. It is illegal to discriminate. So it's important that students and employers do realise. So that does mean that actually employers should be open to applications. The issue around employers asking about whether you have a right to work in the UK, I don't think there's necessarily a way around that, because employers are legally responsible. If you hire somebody and they don't have a visa, they don't have a valid right to work in the UK, you get fined. You get penalised for it. So some of this is HR process that has to be asked. But I think it goes back to that need to explain to employers actually the differences between the visa routes, so that they understand those differences, and also help students to understand where employers are coming from. But I do go back to my point that this is a competitive market for all vacancies. We know how tough it is. So actually, I think there's a danger sometimes that we conflate students who are struggling to get through the application process and get a job generally, as opposed to that being the reason for visas as well. But visas being behind that reason too.
Thanks, Stephen. Alex.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, on the point around the length of the visa, I mean, we would certainly, I think, support any moves that would make the visa more usable for employers. So if that means extending it to 3 for all international students, not just those who've got PhDs, then that would be, in our perspective, a positive development. On the point around employer awareness, I would highlight that, I mean, a lot of SMEs, as I'm sure many of you will know, won't have HR functions, let alone dedicated people to look at these sorts of things, especially if they're much on the smaller side. And they won't have a familiarity with sort of all of the visas out there. So in terms of advice to students, the more obvious they can make this during the sort of process. As Stephen said, employers need to ask whether someone has the right to work in the UK, but perhaps it can be a line in a cover letter, or there might be somewhere in the application where an applicant can indicate that they don't currently have the right to work in the UK, but they can very easily get that at no expense or bureaucracy to the employer, as those two are the main concerns. So yeah, those would be my main points.
Thanks, Alex. Linda.
Yeah, just a couple that I would probably raise. Nick, I would say in the 2 versus 3, I would say I think we've got to keep that continued focus in the sector with the work that we're doing with the government, linking in more to the national skill shortages, because I suppose I live in the optimistic world to think that there is still a chance we can get it to 3 years if we focus on areas where there is a skill shortage in the UK. So I think that's a task for us as a sector. On Tripidi's question, we've been throwing this around internally, coming up with the ideas, and these are probably silly ideas, but actually, can we create a digital badge that goes on to international students' LinkedIn profiles that makes it really clear that they're applying for the graduate route, or they will be eligible for jobs through the graduate routes. But I think there is something there how we can make it easier for international students to create awareness that they will be able to get jobs through the international sort of route. But I think a lot of this is involving students into the solution of this, about how we get everybody confident talking about their eligibility for employment, so that it's actually helping to educate employers, as well as the work that we would do as a sector. Nick, I won't say anything else, because I think Alex and Stephen covered all my other key points.
Great, thank you, Linda. That enables us to go back to the participants. The only thing I would add is, of course, people like Joe Johnson, the former universities minister, who stayed very involved, are calling for a 4-year graduate route visa, not even to the 3. And it's interesting to see his arguments around that. So let's go to Simon. Simon, who has the most upvoted question currently. Simon, tell us where you're from and what your question is.
Hi, Nick. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Great, thanks. So I'm Simon Rayside at the University of Edinburgh. And the question really is just around change a few years back to the Graduate Outcome Survey. I mean, we, as an institution, we've got nearly 50% of our students are international. It's a huge number. We always, when we were running that survey ourselves, made a big concerted effort, had a great response rate up around 80%. Since that's been centralized, it's fallen hugely to the point where I don't think it's really statistically useful. And I just wonder whether this is something that, you know, Linda, you were talking about data, the importance of data. Yeah, whether this is being reflected back to the graduate outcome surveys that's run now.
Thank you, Simon. There's so much debate, isn't there, about home students' outcomes. It's interesting that the international debate is moving in that direction too. So we'll come back to the panel on that in a moment. Can we go to the next one? Nilashis. Sorry if I've mispronounced your name. Do correct me. Good morning. Great. I think you're on. Oh, something might have gone wrong with the tech. We can't hear you. So perhaps I will read out your question. I really like the comment on university careers departments being more aware of the international market and not just confined to their home market. I think that was something I said at the start. Is there any specific training or guidance for careers departments on that question? I look to Linda for that because it was a theme of our penultimate piece of work with Kaplan. 2 anonymous comments which have been upvoted. At what point does the pathway provider or HEI international student recruitment institution, particularly marketing messaging on the graduate route, become mis-selling if there is little to no employers aware or able or willing to offer employment to international students? Are we gearing towards selling a fake dream to international students expecting to stay on and work in a graduate level job post-graduation unless this is resolved? Some strong language there, but a fair question. Are we mis-selling to international students? Another popular anonymous question is, the graduate route visa seems to be attracting an overwhelming number of students from a couple of countries such as Nigeria and India. How could we make it more attractive to a wider group of countries and regions? Is it to do with the short length of the program, which has already come up, of course? Sarah Collins, can we go to Sarah, who has a question? Sarah, tell us where you're calling from and what your question is. Hi, Sarah, can you hear us? Oh, the tech seems to have let us down again. We'll give you one more go. Can you? The text let us down one more go. So Sarah's question is there any chance we could push as a sector for a government-led awareness campaign, for employers? We're all doing our own things to some extent, and it would be great to have a UK-wide campaign that we can all link to. Sorry that tech didn't work there. And then I'll ask just a couple more, and then we'll go back to the panel. Anne-Marie Graham has a question. Many of us will know Anne-Marie Graham. If it's the Anne-Marie Graham I'm thinking it is. Anne-Marie, say who you are.
Hi, Nick. Yes, it's Anne-Marie Graham here. I'm Chief Executive at UKISA, the UK Council for International Student Affairs. Yeah, great session this morning. Thank you. Really great to hear from everyone. I just wanted to sort of drill down a little bit because obviously, as Stephen mentioned, our International Student Employability Group and the great work that he and his colleagues have produced in terms of guidance, but I wondered if the research had been able to drill down really to understand whether or not respondents knew that individuals could switch from the graduate route to the skilled worker route after 2 years or 3 years in the case of PhD students. Is that something we were able to understand throughout the research, or is that something that we need to be thinking about in terms of how we communicate to employers when we take all of these actions from this webinar, I suppose? Yeah.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. I'm going to go back to the panel now because we only have 10 minutes left, and this is your chance to address yourselves to those questions, which are the most popular ones we've currently got in, and also any closing remarks you would like to make. I'm going to go to Linda first this time.
Thanks, Nick. Nick, I'll probably pick up Simon's question maybe first of all, just on the data point. And I think probably there's that general frustration on being centralised, actually the challenge to get the data. I think that's an ongoing area for us to work on in the sector, but actually in the meanwhile, I think there is still real opportunities for individual institutions to be also looking at how they're trying to help collect their own sort of data to use as an institution, because I think it will be slower within the sector to get that going right the way across the UK. So I would probably pull out if I was Vice Chancellor of the university, what the areas I would invest in. One would be that to get the outcome information on my own graduates getting jobs. And the other area, and this links to some of the other questions, is around how we can bring together more alumni offices, career services, and parts of the university working with local companies, because I think there is a strategy that can be developed there that actually does help in terms of increasing awareness of international, employing international sort of students, and then helping international students to get jobs. So that's probably an area that I would put the focus point on. On the mis-selling point, I think it's a very fair question to be asking. I suppose I always live in a world of optimism that actually right now, as Stephen highlighted, not all graduate vacancies are being filled, and therefore I think we're in the world just now of ensuring that we're trying to continue the development of the opportunities for international students to get jobs, so we're not in a position to mis-sell. But if we don't crack these areas, we're going to lose our international students to other destinations around the world. And I think that's more of the bigger missed opportunities. So that would be mine. Nick, I'll hand over to Stephen maybe next.
Thank you. Stephen, you're on mute.
I am. My mute button is being very temperamental this morning. Right, so right, I've got a few points. I'll try and rattle through them quite quickly, Nick, because I am conscious of time. So yes, picking up on that mis-selling piece, I do think we could do with being a bit candid about the debate here, actually, and that is being realistic about why we're having this conversation, or one of those big forces driving it, and it is tuition fees, and it's that universities receive a significant amount of income from international students compared to UK domestic students. There is that strong growth and input into the economy, but that means that the conversation is often being driven by, that's not being driven by employer actual sector demands necessarily. It's not as if it's the labour market saying, we need these students, let's bring them into the country. It's being driven by universities increasing their intake. So that connection gets lost between the labour market and actually what's happening with international students. So I think that's where this danger of mis-selling does come into it. Graduate outcomes, that's probably a whole other webinar, Nick, and we could go into that. But a little bit of, I guess, a bit of a sympathy maybe for employers. We are an employer-led organisation. Imagine if you're an employer sat in front of a careers team at a university, and that university was saying, what about our WP students? Are you hiring them? What about our ethnically diverse students? Are you hiring them? What about our international students? Are you hiring them? The employer sits there and goes, I'm getting 20 or 30,000 applications every year for 500 vacancies. Some people are going to get through and some people aren't. So I think a bit of candor around that side of the equation would help increase understanding on both sides. Agree about labour market data, but it is tricky for home markets. I would love to be able to point people to good data on labour markets at individual countries. We've got to be realistic that it's really just US, UK, some bits of Asia Pac that have good labour market data and vacancies. It's really hard to get hold of. So I think that is a challenge. And yes, that point around political campaigning, is there something about campaign? Going back to Anne-Marie Graham, that employer's guide really is a useful, well through piece of document. I can't realistically imagine in the political climate, though, this government doing a big campaign about hiring more international students into the labour market, though. But I'll leave that for somebody more politically astute than I am, Nick.
Thank you, Stephen. Alex.
Yeah, thank you. Just on the mis-selling point, purely from the sort of perspective of employers, I mean, in the research that we did, it was only 20% of employers who said they wouldn't consider using the graduate route visa. I would say demand from employers is there, but what isn't always there is employer understanding of the various visa routes. So I think what we need to be working on is awareness around the sort of government campaign point. Yes, certainly something we would welcome. As Stephen said, I'm not sure the political will would be there at the moment. I think the government is more focused on other areas of the labour market, particularly sort of at the moment over 50s is the sort of government's main focus, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be saying that it would be helpful, certainly to employers and to international students, for an awareness campaign. And on the final point around what the research did, we didn't have an opportunity to ask around the awareness of the ability to switch visas. I do think that would be very helpful if we had more data on that. I would say just generally employer awareness of all of these schemes is low. So I would assume that understanding of being able to switch between one to another would also be low. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. As we still have 3 or 4 minutes, a couple of things I want to say, but I wonder if we could just turn on Mandy Higgins's microphone, because I think she's made an important point that we haven't said very much about today, and she's an immigration lawyer. Mandy, could you tell us your point, because I think it's important.
Hello, can you hear me?
You can.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Yeah, I'm Mandy Higgins. I'm Head of Business Immigration at Waitman Solicitors. I do actively promote the graduate visa to my clients and give them all the details necessary. And I do have a number of clients who've advised applicants to apply for the graduate visa. However, a couple of students have said that they don't want to apply for the graduate visa. They love the UK, they want to stay here, they want to settle in the UK. Any time spent on a graduate visa does not count towards indefinite leave to remain in the UK. So they want to get that clock ticking as soon as possible. So I've had situations where individual students have said, I don't want to apply for the graduate visa because then I've got another 2 years. I want to start the clock ticking on my ILR immediately. So I want sponsorship. And if you're not going to offer me sponsorship, then I'm going to go somewhere else. So that is an issue that I have seen.
Thank you, Mandy. I think it's an important point. I think one of the things that came through our research was that the graduate route visa is fantastic for many people, many employers in many circumstances, but absolutely not all. And I think we've heard that it doesn't always work for employers. And now your point is that it doesn't always work for individuals either. And I think it does need to be a constant state of improvement. So I'm really grateful to you for making that point. So we've come pretty much to the end of our time. I just want to say 2 things, well, 3 things really before we close. First of all, as I said at the beginning, we've done lots of work on international students over the years, many of our biggest projects, normally in conjunction with Linda and her colleagues. We'd like to go on doing that. So do come forward to us with ideas for further events, further reports. HEPI is a very small organisation, but this is as important an issue, if not more important than any other. We'd like to go on working on that. Secondly, I'd like to thank all of you for staying. We've had a really good attendance at this webinar through the whole session. And I'd like to thank Linda, who are our partner on this, of course, plus Alex, both for helping us with the polling and for her comments today, and Stephen. And I think it was very great that we had the voice of the larger employers through Stephen and the voice of the smaller employers through Alex, because these issues don't always look the same, depending on what sort of employer you are. And then just before you all go off to do the other important things you need to do, I'm just going to share my screen one more time to plug 1 or 2 things we at HEPI have coming up, including a midnight tonight, a report. It's really about research, but actually the lessons go way beyond research about how we might want to talk to policymakers to persuade them. We've done interviews with former ministers, former special advisors, former civil servants about the sort of evidence that they want. And although the report about research, the lessons cover really everything to do with higher education. And this is our first event of 2023, but we've got a very busy events program over the spring and summer coming up. So do look on our website for those. One event you might be particularly interested in is we've got Andreas Schleicher delivering our annual lecture in a couple of months' time. He I think knows more about education around the world than anybody else I've ever met. So if you are free and available to come, do please consider doing so. But with that, bang on 11 o'clock, I'm going to call a halt to the proceedings. And if we didn't get to your question, I apologize, but do feel free to email any of us and we can maybe take some of it offline. Many thanks. And thank you finally as well to my colleague Emma, who's done all the logistics and made sure the morning's gone smoothly, who without her, this wouldn't have happened. Thank you and goodbye.